We are back here on The Drive here on 104.5 The Team, ESPN Radio, the free 104.5 The Team app, the Capital Region's home for New York sports. The Jets and the Giants, well, their seasons have been done for a little while, but that doesn't mean, Mike, that there still aren't questions abound for both of those groups. You are a Jets fan. You have a lot of them. I have a lot of them too, quite honestly, with what is probably going to be a pretty pivotal season coming up for Gang Green. So with that being said, we welcome back onto the show, host of the Jake Asman Show on YouTube, as well as a host on ESPN Radio New York 98.7 and ESPN Radio National. That is Jake Asman. Mr. Asman, how are you, sir?
What's going on, guys? Thanks for having me back on the show.
Great to have you back. Are things a bit calmer this week where we find you based on the Christmas hectic Christmas schedule that you had when we talked last?
Yeah, I haven't had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning since, so that's been nice. I had a great time filling in for Rick and Dave that week, but it's nice to sleep in a little bit.
Yeah, I can imagine it is. Well, I'm glad that it's kind of back and leveled off for you a little bit, but it was still a lot of fun to hear over the Christmas holiday. But let's get right into where this Jets team sits right now as we're kind of in post-mortem mode. During the last few weeks of the year when the reality of the team the fate was kind of sealed, we found out Aaron Rodgers wouldn't be coming back. Was there anything down the stretch in 23 that kind of jumped out to you as a positive to look forward to in 24?
Well, you certainly still have a really good defense, and I think we knew that coming in, but they faced a gauntlet of quarterbacks, and for the most part, they played really, really well against those said quarterbacks. I mean, they finished, I believe, as a third-rated defense, courtesy of DVOA, which factors in field position, factors in strength of opponent. Basically, it's a better way to look at defensive metrics instead of just points per game allowed or yards and some of the other traditional stats. So, look, the eye test kind of matched that stat. This team was really, really good on defense, and they were obviously abysmal on offense, despite having 1,000-yard receiver again in Garrett Wilson and a 1,500-yard from scrimmage player in Breece Hall. So the positive is most of this defense is under contract besides Bryce Huff, and that's one of their big questions they'll have to address this offseason, what to do with him. But if you want to focus on positives, if you do get Aaron Rodgers back and he's healthy and you have this defense, assuming the Jets could find a way to make some upgrades on the O-line and probably another receiver or two, this, at least on paper, is a good football team going into next year.
With free agency and the draft still to go, do you think? How do you think Rodgers is going to stack up against this gauntlet of AFC quarterbacks? Burrow, Stroud, Mahomes, Allen, Lamar, Herbert. Do you think he's going to come back and step into that MVP form? I know in 2022 he wasn't his usual self. He was still a very good quarterback, but where do you think he stacks up against these AFC quarterbacks?
I think he'll be in the mix. I don't know if he's going to be what he was in 2020, 2021 when he was, throwing for, 45-plus touchdowns and winning the MVP. But, I think he still could be a very good quarterback. He's going to come back and be highly motivated to prove he's not done, to prove that he made the right choice, wanting to play for the Jets. And it's on the Jets to help him, right? I mean, obviously, some of it's luck. You can't expect anyone to get hurt in the fourth play of the year. But there were major question marks about the Jets' offensive line going into this past year. And those questions were answered resoundingly that they weren't good enough. In fact, they need to make several additions there. But I'm still going to operate under the premise that if Rodgers is coming back, he's still going to be able to be a top 12 quarterback in the league. And with this defense, that should be enough to go from 7-10 to 10-7, and you're in the playoffs. But there's a lot of things they got to get done before you can even have that conversation.
And let's talk about some of those tasks to kind of break it up into players out and players in. To start with players out, how does the roster construction look like in terms of players who will be leaving? Any familiar names who you would not expect to be back come 2024?
Well, I think there's a couple of obvious guys that they could look to cut to try and save cap space. One of them is C.J. Uzomah, who got hurt at the end of the season. So he seems like a guy that's an obvious cap casualty. I'll tell you what a big question is going to be. What do they do with Laken Tomlinson, their left guard? Now, he's the only guy on that offensive line that actually started every game and made it through the 17-game season, but he wasn't very good. He allowed the most pressures out of any left guard in football. If you cut him, you save about $10 million on your salary cap. Is that something the Jets want to do? Or because he's been durable, they want to just pencil him in as a starter and say, look, we could live with Tomlinson as one of our starters if we surround him with a better left tackle, a better right tackle, et cetera. I don't know. I would probably assume they try to get him to take a pay cut, and if not, maybe they look to cut him. But he's certainly a name to watch. And then really the big question is going to be with Bryce Huff. He's an unrestricted free agent. He had a 10.5 sack year. He's talked about how he's not going to give a hometown discount. Why would he? He was an undrafted free agent that has yet to make big money yet. This could be his one opportunity to do so. You'd think the Jets would want to keep him, but what's his value for a guy who only played 42% of the snaps this past year? That's a major question they're going to have to answer. And if they can't keep him, do they use the franchise tag on him and try and tag and trade him? Do they just let him go and only get a compensatory pick? I think the Bryce Huff situation, that's the most intriguing, in-house free agent storyline to watch with the Jets.
So O-line and wide receiver, the biggest needs on this team, in my opinion. Like outside of Garrett Wilson, this receiver room needs a lot of help. So what direction do you see them going in free agency? Do you see them looking to the top of the market at receiver, T. Higgins, Calvin Ridley? For O-line, maybe Tyron Smith. What kind of guys do you see them going after in free agency?
Yeah, it's a great question because I do see them absolutely trying to sign Tyron Smith, trying to sign one of the better available tackles in free agency. And then you have the Elijah Vera-Tucker factor in all this. Do they view him as a guard or a right tackle? That's something they wait till after the draft. And, whenever they didn't draft or fill in free agency, okay, we need a guard. Boom, AVT's our right or left guard. Oh, we need a tackle. Well, AVT could be our right tackle. So I think that question certainly is impacted by what they do in free agency. I expect the Jets to sign at least one tackle in free agency and probably a guard as well to give them some flexibility. And then I think when you look at receiver, to me, it's such a big question on which receivers are actually going to become available. Like Mike Evans is a free agent. I'd be shocked if Tampa let him go. Same thing with Michael Pittman with the Colts. And then there's T. Higgins, who you would think will hit the open market because it's tough to pay Burrow and pay Jamar Chase. But you're going to have a lot of competition for T. Higgins. He's 26 years old. He's really, really good. He's probably a number one. He just can't be a number one on the current team he's on. So if the Jets do pursue him and don't get him, all right, well, what's the alternative? Is there a trade for someone we're not thinking of? It seems like every year there's another receiver trade that comes out of nowhere, whether it's Tyreek Hill or A.J. Brown or Stephon Diggs a few years ago. So, look, I think the Jets are going to be active trying to sign a receiver. One name to watch for a guy that I do expect to hit free agency is Calvin Ridley. It sounds like him and the Jaguars are not going to reach an extension. If they give him an extension, that trade where they traded a third to Atlanta becomes a second. So I think Ridley hits the open market, and that's the guy the Jets could look to bring in as the wide receiver 2 next to Garrett Wilson. So that, to me, is the name to watch.
Man, that is a fascinating one to watch for sure. The voice you're hearing, that of Jake Asman, host of the Jake Asman Show on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to that for updates on the Jets as we move through the offseason. You can also hear him on ESPN Radio New York and ESPN Radio nationally from time to time. Make sure you follow him on Twitter at Jake Asman, as well as the show at Jake Asman Show, ASMAN. The one name we haven't really hit on, it's been the punching bag for Jets fans for a couple years. That is Zack Wilson. Is there any path that he is on this roster come 2024? And do you see anything in his game that would suggest maybe with a fresh start he could turn into something that's NFL worthy?
I would be surprised if he ever turns out to be a franchise quarterback. I mean, years from now, could he have a Geno Smith-like resurgence? I guess, but the Jets unfortunately can't wait around for that. I fully expect him to be traded at some point this offseason. I wouldn't expect much. It's probably a day 3 pick. Maybe it's a day 3 pick with some conditions on it, where it's like a 6th, but could become a 5th if he makes the team, or he plays X amount of snaps on a team. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure what teams are going to actually want Zack Wilson. But I think there'll be a team that will take a chance on him because he does have a lot of physical talent, and I would expect that trade to happen when the new league year begins.
So the plan at pick 10 seems to be every mock draft to read is O-line or wide receiver. I think it's going to be O-line, even if Joe Alt is off the board. And if he's not, I mean, that'd be a miracle, but I think he's going to be off the board. But do you think this pick at number 10 could be anything but O-line? Do you see them maybe getting receiver, Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, or do you see them just going safe with O-line here?
I think a lot of what they do at 10 is impacted by what they do in free agency. If they sign a bunch of linemen and, they love Malik Neighbors or Rome Odunze, or even Brock Bowers for that matter, if he's there at 10, maybe they would pull the trigger. But I would be really surprised if the Jets don't end up taking an offensive tackle with pick 10. If Joe Alt's not there, but Olu Fashanu is there, the tackle from Penn State, I think that's the pick you make. He's considered by all the quote-unquote draft guys to be the best pass protector out of any of the linemen. And, okay, if you tell me his run blocking's not as good, but he's an elite pass protector already as a rookie, that's kind of perfect for what the Jets need. So if he's there, I would expect him to be the pick. And I'd be surprised if Pick 10 doesn't end up being a lineman, even if it's like Talise Fuaga or J.C. Latham or some of the other guys in this really highly regarded tackle class.
Interesting. I think that would be a very good fit in that regard. As you kind of continue to take a look at the draft picks down the road, any specific areas in terms of adding depth to the roster or even possibly bringing in a starter that you could see the Jets going as they move through their picks in subsequent rounds?
Yeah, maybe Curtis Samuel for another receiver type. Like, you got to remember last year they signed Lazard and they signed Mecole Hardman for less than $4 million. So who's a guy that you can get maybe that second wave of free agency to add to your complement of playmakers? I think that's something to watch. And I also could see, I brought up the idea of a trade. A guy to maybe to look at is like Cortland Sutton. He made a post implying he's played his last game in Denver. The Broncos are $24 million over the cap. When they cut Russell Wilson as a June 1st designation, so there'll be $64 million over the cap at that point. The Jets have Sutton's former wide receiver coach on their staff. Could that be a guy they acquire, and then maybe they still look to sign like another receiver? So I think you got to be creative here because they need receivers and offensive line. That's why, while the Jets seemingly are far away, they're not as far away as you think because you have the defense, you have the quarterback. You just have to address offensive line and get another receiver, and you should be able to compete in the AFC East.
So we have the quarterback for this year, probably for next year, but there really isn't any long-term answer at quarterback for this Jets team. So do you see them maybe looking at a quarterback later in the draft, a guy like Jordan Travis, Spencer Rattler maybe?
For sure. I think if they go quarterback, you have the right idea. It'd be on day 3. I don't think they're going to use pick 10 on a quarterback. I don't think they're going to use their 3rd-round pick on a quarterback. But if they took a dart throw on someone on day 3, that would be, QB3 and sits behind Aaron Rodgers and, the QB2 they're going to sign, like a Jacoby Brissett or Gardner Minshew type, I think every Jet fan would be on board with that. The time to go quarterback in round 1 is potentially in 2025 when you see what happens with Rodgers and you see how things, churn out for the Jets. But I'd be shocked if they did it I'd be shocked if they did it earlier than day 3 of the draft.
So throughout a full season, and I'm just curious because you're a big part of Jets Twitter. So throughout the full season, you see a lot. I myself see a lot of abysmal takes from a lot of different people on the Jets. So what do you think the most common take on Jets Twitter is that you would disagree with? I just feel like there's so many like common narratives among Jets fans. So is there any one that sticks out to you?
I guess it depends on who you ask, you talk to, right? I mean, I coined the Zack Wilson defenders truthers because it's like every metric you have that he's terrible, you see, and then the eye test matches that as well. But there are these people who are just delusional that think somehow he's been wronged by the Jets and they have failed him. And sure, do the Jets have a great O-line? No. Do they have a tremendous amount of receiver talent? No. But do they have more than enough for Zack Wilson not to be terrible for basically all but 1 or 2 of his starts we could point to in 3 years? To me, that's the one that drives me crazy. And then you have all these people that are now doubting Aaron Rodgers. It's like you're the same people that defend Zack Wilson. If you're going to be a truther for someone, be a truther for a guy who's won 4 MVPs who wanted to play for the Jets, who took $35 million less to become a Jet, largest pay cut in team sports history. So the Zack Wilson truther stuff on Twitter is some of the most insane stuff I see. So I would probably go with that if that fits the criteria of your question.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure we'll find this out in October, but is there maybe a problem that no one's talking about for this Jets team coming into next year? Because I know everyone's kind of hyper fixated on we need Rodgers healthy, we need the O-line good, and we need more receivers surrounding Garrett Wilson. So is there another maybe problem? Are you worried about the coaching? Are you worried about a certain positional group on defense maybe?
Yeah, I mean, coaching is certainly a concern, right? I mean, God forbid something happens to Rodgers. We saw what this offensive staff looked like without him. So, everyone's focused on the line and the receivers, and I get it. But, Robert Saleh's got a lot to prove. Most coaches that have 3 straight losing years to start their career aren't back for a 4th year. We know why he is. Obviously, the record, you need to add context to it when you consider his quarterbacks, and he deserves credit for the defense being as good as they've been these last 2 seasons. But, until they win, guys, there's going to be major question marks with this coaching staff and this GM as well. Everyone loved Joe Douglas. I get it. He did a lot of good. But, this past year did a lot of damage to his Q score with the fan base. So they need a monster offseason. They need a really strong draft. And they got to get off to a good start because I'm telling you, if the Jets lose week 1, there's going to be people saying fire Saleh, which is not going to happen. But, this fan base is wound up, and we wanted blood at the end of this year, and the fan base didn't get it, so
True.
They got to win right away.
Very true.
Jake, let's say you're Woody Johnson. After this season, would you have moved on from Douglas and Saleh, or are you giving him kind of I wouldn't say a mulligan, but that's kind of seems like what they've been getting because the offense has just been so bad. Would you have moved on from Douglas and Saleh, maybe just one of them, or what would you have done? Let's say you're Woody Johnson.
So if I was Woody, I was either keeping both of them like he did or getting rid of both of them. I don't think Joe Douglas should get to hire another coach personally. Like, yes, the roster is better, and he's better than McCagnon, and he's better than Izek, but and that's the bar we're only judging Jets GMs on. Like, that's just like the definition of like mediocre. Like, Douglas has done some great moves. He's made some terrible moves. I think if you kind of look at the whole body of work, he's been a mediocre GM, which is fine if you hit on the quarterback, which is the big key now with Rodgers coming back, being healthy. I understand why what he did. It's easier to move on from both next year when both their contracts are up and you see what this looks like with Rodgers playing. But it's certainly risky because you can't sit here and tell me that, the Jets wouldn't probably be in a better shape if they replaced Robert Saleh with Mike Vrabel, for example. So it's a conundrum. I understand why Woody did what he did. He believes in Rodgers. Rodgers is going to back the guys that have been loyal to him. But it better work. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of people out of a job this time next year.
Yeah, it's tough looking at those candidates and kind of sticking with Saleh there.
Yeah, I can imagine that's where a lot of the Jets fan base feels. But good, bad, or otherwise, in 1 year's time, wherever we stand, we'll be following Jake's coverage for all of it. Again, make sure you subscribe to the Jake Asman Show on YouTube. Follow him and the show on Twitter as well. And every now and again, you'll hear him on ESPN Radio 98.7 down in New York, as well as ESPN Radio National. And hopefully, we're lucky enough to have those shows here on our airwaves. Jake, always a pleasure. Thank you, as always, for the time and the insight into this forever frustrating group. We always appreciate it. And we'll talk to you soon as we get closer to free agency and the draft.
I appreciate it, guys. Always a pleasure to join you guys. Thanks for having me.
The pleasure is ours. That's Jake Asman covering the New York Jets. We'll take a break here on The Drive. Be back with more of our program right after this.